Welcome to session 2 of Archaeology in the Bible. Today we're going to speak a little bit more about the Bible itself and its relationship to archaeology, even how archaeology can look at the Bible as an artifact. So this is an area that sometimes is a little bit fraught with peril, as it were. I remember a few years ago, an older member of our congregation who knew I was interested in biblical archaeology kind of took me to task and said, if you just had a little bit more faith, Russ, you wouldn't need to do all that archaeology stuff. You just need to believe, and then you wouldn't need all this proof. And I really gave that a lot of consideration, and I think that that God has given all these bits of evidence for us to find as pieces of encouragement, and it actually ends up strengthening my faith. So hopefully that's something that it does for each of you as well. So there is a danger in going too far one way or the other. Here's a quote from Daniel Wallace. Evangelicals often have a tendency to find implausible solutions to difficulties in the Bible and to be satisfied that they have once again vindicated the Word of God. On the other hand, critical scholars tend to find errors in the Bible where none exist. So we have that in terms of extremes, but how do you balance kind of the science and the aspect of being a believer? Well, at least one of my professors, Dr. Gary Byers, says that archaeology helps me to trust the Bible for the past so that I can trust the Bible for the future. And another of my professors, Dr. Stephen Collins, comments on biblical inerrancy, which is quite often a hot button issue. I don't believe that the Bible is inerrant because it tells me so. I believe that the Bible is inerrant because I've looked into the things that it claims and found them to be true. So with that to get us started off, let's talk about the Bible as archaeology. And really the first thing we should do is to look at what archaeology can do, because unfortunately in many cases we ask it to do a bit more than we should. So archaeology can aid our understanding of the Bible's original context. These artifacts that we find come from the exact same world, from the culture that produced the Bible. And it can give us great insight into the day-to-day life and the customs of those people. We have to always remember that our modern interpretations are several thousand years removed from these actual events, so it is easy for us to misinterpret things. An example here is the common four-room house in the Holy Land. It's often called an Israel house, which tends to make some of the Arabic archaeologists quite upset, but that's the term that has been found for it. But this four-room house gives us a better picture of what daily life in the Bible times might have been, and you can see that quite often that lower story was an area for livestock, and then you have the upper rooms, and then even the roof was a living area, and we see examples of that in various biblical texts, especially in the New Testament time frame. Not only do we get a better feel for the Bible's context, in terms of that context, archaeology can really expand our knowledge of the biblical languages. We have these finds outside of the Bible of inscriptions and other sorts of texts that give us an opportunity to learn more about word usage and about meaning. Many times the writings, not only from Israel itself, but from its neighbors, will give us some unique and very confirming type insights. There are many loan words in Hebrew that come from the Egyptians, from the Hittites, from various other Canaanite cultures in the area, and that just gives you a feel for how much interaction there was between these societies, that their languages were kind of developing along with each other and intermingling in some cases. Now, this is the very common thing that most people are aware of in terms of the languages. This is the Rosetta Stone. It was discovered in the early 1800s. It's a large stone that has a decree of the pharaoh in three different languages. It's in Greek, it's in hieroglyphs, and it's in the Demotic script. And at the time in the 1800s, of course, many scholars could read the Greek, but no one could read the other two types. And not that it just was an immediate translation tool, but within about 20 years, it really gave the key to deciphering hieroglyphics specifically. And now hieroglyphics are easily read by Egyptologists. One that's a little closer to our interest in the Bible, this is the Proto-Sinaitic script. It was found in the Sinai desert, and this is an inscription in stone. It's the earliest known Hebrew Canaanite alphabet. This inscription predates when scholars thought such an alphabet occurred by at least 600, 700, 800 years. So this puts it somewhere in the 18 to 1900 BC range, when in many cases scholars were thinking it was more about the 1200 range, which one of their common complaints about Hebrew was that there was no written form of it far enough back for the events of the Bible. Also, archaeology can complement the witness of the Bible. I don't know about you, but there have been many cases where I'll read a biblical account and I really wish I knew more. There are details that I would have liked to have known, and they are just not included. And they're not included because they're not relevant to the message that the Bible is trying to get across. However, we find that in some cases, archaeology can fill in those gaps. Noteworthy example is Omri, who was king of Israel. In terms of the Bible, he's mentioned in just a few verses in First Kings, but we have several archaeological finds that concern Omri. An interesting one is the Mesha stele. It's also called the Moabite stone. The king of Moab, Mesha, commissioned this, and it would appear that at the time of this, that Moab and Israel were not on good terms. In fact, Moab had been under the control of Israel and had to pay tribute. So Mesha is not very complimentary on this stone of the king of Israel, that being Omri. And so we've found lots of archaeological evidence of buildings in his capital city of Samaria. And then also we have a little bit later, here is an inscription from an Assyrian monument, and this is Jehu, who is a later king of Israel. But the noteworthy thing in the inscription of the Assyrians, it calls Jehu a king of the house of Omri, and here he's shown paying tribute to the Assyrians who had control over Israel at the time. So we've talked a little bit about what archaeology can do, but perhaps it is more instructive to talk about what archaeology can't or shouldn't do. One thing, it just really can't give us the full picture. We have to bear in mind here that only a very small percentage, a fraction of a percent of ancient material culture has been discovered. There's still a great deal left in the ground, and there's quite a bit of it that was just destroyed and will never be found. Probably Egyptology is the best developed of all the ancient studies, both archaeology-wise and also in terms of the language and other studies. And less than 1% of all the known sites in ancient Egypt have actually been excavated. And really, if you want to zoom into a specific site, for any given site, probably no more than about 5% of the total site can be excavated just due to time and expense and so forth. And really, to put it all into perspective, of the 500,000 cuneiform tablets that have been recovered throughout the ancient Near East, only about 10% of those have been translated and published, and the rest just lie in storage, waiting for their turn to. So who knows what discoveries are remaining there. Archaeology also can't tell us what people were thinking, unless they write it down, of course. But because of the differences in our culture, people are the same, but cultures tend to be different. There's always going to be that probability that when we see something from an ancient culture, we're quite likely to get it wrong. We should really be very, very cautious when we're making those interpretations. It's and I'll as a little aside here, I'll let you in on something that some of my professors have told me. If you ever hear an archaeologist say something is of cultic significance, cultic being religious, that is shorthand for I have no earthly idea what it is or what it does. And so that's kind of the standard go-to answer if you're just not really sure of what's going on. We would probably find that ancient people would see some of our modern interpretations of their culture, and they would probably find it pretty amusing or possibly quite insulting. So another thing archaeology can't do, it can't prove the Bible, and this has gotten us in a lot of trouble. In the end, as a believer, we would consider the Bible to be the source of truth. So the source of truth doesn't need proving. And when you get out there and try to prove it, like in the quote at the very beginning, you go to some unreasonable extremes and you can shade things and everything and make things much worse. And there are a lot of things in the Bible that are not provable. Many of the accounts of biblical characters' interactions with God, they can really be neither proven nor disproven. They are just like your relationship with God. It is a personal thing that is really not something for someone else. They're really matters of faith. And what archaeology can do is it can at least comment on the historicity or the authenticity of a biblical account, but even then only in a partial sense, because if we don't find evidence of something, it doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means we haven't found it yet. So here's where it gets very interesting. The scholarly problems. We live in a society now where the Bible really is not as valued and revered as it once was. And a goodly amount of that is because of the constant criticism that's come from scholarly sources. And where did that come from? Well, let's reach back to the 19th century. The 1800s were really a time of great scientific discovery, lots of scientific investigation, and everything was up for grabs. Everything could be reinterpreted and reevaluated. And that included Old Testament studies. And so a lot of these academics would fashion these new theories about what they thought may have happened with the Bible and so forth. And these all happened before there was a lot of archaeology, and really before some of the ancient Near East studies, where they would study the languages of the neighbors of Israel and so forth. Before those things really started going, and so they weren't available to them. So they basically created these theories in a vacuum. Unfortunately, they haven't changed those theories, even when there has been additional information that would cause you to want to reevaluate some of your theories and your hypotheses. So really what drove this is the theory of evolution. Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859, and it created a huge upheaval in the sciences. Now, we always associate Darwin with evolution in terms of the life sciences. And we certainly won't get into any big discussion of that here, but that's what everybody associates it with. But evolutionary theory moved quickly from the life sciences to the social sciences and even beyond that. And one place that got really excited about evolutionary theory was anthropology. And the anthropologists really started to apply that evolutionary theory to all the different aspects of how societies develop. Just like a monkey starts to walk and hunched over and then walks a little straighter and walks a little straighter, and before you know it, it's a man. You have the same kind of progression of societies. And because scientists love to categorize things and make them into models, you have this outlook that says, okay, for certain periods of social development, there are going to be also associated religious type practices. So the more primitive a person or a society is, the more primitive the religious observances are going to be. And as they progress, as they become more advanced, their religious practices become more advanced. And so that's just, those two just kind of go together. So for example, if you're a nomad, you're going to be worshiping animals. You're going to be worshiping nature. You are not going to have a highly developed religious process or anything else, and that's just kind of the way it goes. So bear that in mind as we go deeper into this, because this is going to be a foundational sense to some of these criticisms of 19th century scholarship. And really, the evolutionary theory kind of spawned the higher criticism and lower criticism concepts, especially in terms of looking at the Bible. It really became a sense of analyzing the Bible as literature with evolution in mind. So here's kind of how it breaks down. Lower criticism is all about the text. It's very much of a physical type thing. How was the text copied? How was it translated? How did it progress, down the centuries, so forth. So that's where you get the lower criticism side. But higher criticism likes to take a much bigger picture look, and it's also been called deconstruction. It's very much of a literary analysis technique where they try to look at a text and the way it's written, and they assume that it's changed over time, and they try to guess. I shouldn't say guess. They wouldn't call it guessing, but they try to figure out how it's changed, what it was like before, and where it came from at that point. And they're really looking for, if you want to put the air quotes around it, they're looking for that deeper truth. So higher criticism becomes all about questioning your previous assumptions, and in many cases, not only questioning those assumptions, but just flat out discarding them. And so higher criticism in the biblical sense, and there's higher criticism in other aspects beyond the Bible too, but higher criticism in terms of the Bible led to what's called the documentary hypothesis. And this really was a deconstruction of the Pentateuch, which that's the first 5 books of the Old Testament that are traditionally authored by Moses. But the deconstruction led these experts, these higher critics, to determine that, there is no way that these 5 books could have been written by one person. Had to have been at least 4 different people. And then they launch into telling you why. Because there are different names in the Hebrew for God, and so obviously people would only have one name for God. So that must be different people each time you see a different name who contributed to that. And then also just the advanced state of the religion, the monotheism of Abraham, that just did not fly at all, because Abraham was a nomad, and nomads, they worship nature. They're building altars and trying to speak to animals and the wind and the clouds and so forth. So there's no way that was the case, which makes them believe that all of this stuff must have been written much later than the time of Abraham, when people really were worshiping in that fashion. And we'll reach into that a little bit additionally as we go on. Here's a graphic, hopefully, that helps this a little bit. You have about the 900 BC time frame, and bear in mind the time of Abraham is probably more like about 1800 BC. But the scholars will tell you you had J and E, and those names come from Jehovah or Yahweh, and E is Elohim. Those are two of the main different names of God used in the Pentateuch. So obviously these were different writers who were writing these portions. And again, they say, well, they couldn't have been doing this at the time of Abraham because there was no Hebrew writing at the time of Abraham. But we now know from about 3 or 4 slides ago that's just not the case. That there was a Hebrew alphabet even back in that time frame. So then J and E come together, and then a few hundred years go by, and then you have the addition of the D and the P. The D is Deuteronomic, and the P is priestly. Deuteronomic is more about the history, the Exodus, the Numbers, and so forth, and particularly the book of Deuteronomy, of course. And then you have the P, the priestly, because you see such advanced religious concepts in these early books. They are assuming that these more advanced priests, much later in time, wrote these particular sections, and so that's why they show these advanced concepts. Quite a few scholars, and some of the more radical ones, will tell you that the entire Pentateuch was probably written sometime in the Babylonian captivity or even later. So even from this graphic, maybe according to them, it was maybe written more like about 300 BC or 400 BC, which gives you an even larger separation between the time frame that these things supposedly occurred and the time frame that they were written down. And all the scholars are going to tell you the further that distance is between the time it was that something was actually occurring and then when it was written down, the more likely that you didn't get a very true or realistic account of it. And again, some of your more radical scholars will tell you, well, these first 5 books are purely mythological. They have no basis in truth because they were written so long after the actual events. So it is very important to see what really is here to tell us, or to give us a feel for when these accounts may have been written. A little bit more about J, E, P, and D, and then they stuck some guy named R in there. But looking at these contributions, you can see it is all over the place. It's a patchwork. It's a patchwork quilt according to this particular theory. And again, what these scholars will tell you is with this many different authors, there's going to be all kinds of inconsistencies. So the books are just all over the place, and with the composition so far after the actual events, these writers are going to write about stuff of their time, and that won't line up with what actually happened 500, 700, 1,000 years before. So there'll be a lot of what are called anachronisms. These are going to be modern concepts, or at least modern at the time of the writing, that are mistakenly put into an earlier period. And so that's one of the key criticisms that's made of the Pentateuch. And we'll be talking about a certain amount of this going forward. So in terms of this, as the scholarship gets critical, higher criticism becomes hyper criticism. It goes beyond just questioning tradition to essentially being a rejection of tradition, even without investigation. It's false, no matter what. There's always a deeper truth, and it's never what it says it is. And you'll find that some of these hypercritical scholars will begin to act that way if you see any kind of evidence that maybe comes from archaeology that tends to support the Bible or tends to contradict higher criticism. You'll see them very quickly dismiss it. Even some of the more modern cases of finds in the last 20 years or so There have been quite a few accusations of forgery. And that, again, is not to say that there haven't been forgeries, because there have been, for various reasons. One aspect that there's a lot of money to be made in forgery of antiquities, but it's again a knee-jerk reaction of these hypercritical scholars. Another thing, and we talked about this very briefly, but you have great danger in arguing from the negative. One of our books likes to say, absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence. Basically, just because we haven't found it yet doesn't mean it's not there. It just means we haven't found it yet. Often there have been great criticisms of there's no archaeological evidence for the patriarchs. Well, the patriarchs were a nomadic society and they lived in tents, so wouldn't be a lot of material culture to find there after 3,500 years. The same for Exodus and the Israelites wandering in the desert. Probably my favorite criticism, though, in the arguing from the negative, in the mid-1800s, the popular thing to say was, well, the Bible talks about the Hittites all over the place, and there is no such thing as the Hittites. We've never seen anything. They're mythical people, so the Bible's wrong again. Until the late 1800s, when a Turkish farmer is plowing his field and he falls in a hole, and lo and behold, he falls into the royal archives of the Hittite Empire. And now we know lots about the Hittites, and we know that they were very involved both with the Egyptians and also somewhat with the people of Canaan and Syria. So you have to be very conscious that you got to leave yourself some room for some future discoveries or developments. You can't just say we've not found it, therefore it doesn't exist. Another thing we want to make sure we cover here is the maximalist versus the minimalist. We've got to get the terminology straight here. And this again comes back to our earlier quote. We have maximalists. These people are all about preconceived notions on both sides. The maximalists are going to, they have a desire to believe anything that supports the biblical account. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, in terms of science, it causes them to engage in wishful thinking, it causes them to interpret things a certain way, to push things a certain way. And that has really led to poor technique, poor scholarship, and even some misleading claims, which has caused really, even in this day and age, a lot of biblical archaeology is sort of looked down upon by the more norm of archaeology because of kind of that questionable work. And so if you talk to a lot of modern biblical archaeologists, or I should say a lot of modern Bible-believing archaeologists, they feel the need to do it as well or better than the secular guys do in terms of practicing the archaeology, so that they don't get dismissed, so that they can be taken seriously when they start to make their claims. Now the minimalists, it's completely the other side of the coin. These are those hypercritical people again who aren't even willing to use the Bible, in terms of its cultural significance or the history that we know that it's gotten right. They just reject the Bible out of hand for any of those sorts of things. So we talked a little bit about lower criticism, and it's all about the text. And so let's look at the text just a little bit. We have copying and transmission. That's a key aspect, and really the things that come to play there are the writing materials, and also the people doing the writing, the scribes. So let's talk material just a little bit. We have papyrus, which is similar to paper. It's made from a plant that grows along the Nile in Egypt. And there are some ancient examples that survive to this day, but it has to be in a pretty dry environment. Has to be protected fairly significantly. Even then, it's usually only small fragments. Just imagine how fragile paper is today, and you get a feel for how papyrus is. This particular example we have here is Egyptian, and it has Egyptian hieroglyphics inked onto it. Probably the more noteworthy is cuneiform. That was a writing style that was used primarily in Mesopotamia, kind of in the modern Iraq area, but it spread throughout the ancient Near East. It became kind of the standard for diplomacy and for commerce and everything else. But cuneiform uses like a wedge-shaped stylus, so it's a stick with kind of a triangular point on the end of it to make these marks, to press these marks into clay, and then the clay will dry and create a very durable surface. Some of these we have cuneiform tablets that are at least 4,000 years old. Some maybe even a little bit older than that. I know one of my professors was talking about most of the time when you see a cuneiform tablet, it's fairly small. It's maybe 4 inches by 4 inches, 6 inches by 6 inches. They're never very big, and there was a great discussion of why that is. And eventually, someone said, well, because when you're pressing into this wet clay, you can only write so much before the clay dries. So you're a little bit limited to the practical size. Now, also there was parchment. That's something we see a lot more of in the Middle Ages, but it was available at this time frame as well. Parchment is going to be made from a cured animal skin. If you've heard the term vellum, that is a form of parchment that's made from the skin of a calf. Now, the parchment is going to be a lot more durable than the papyrus, not nearly as fragile. In general, the parchment would last anywhere from 200 to 400 or 500 years, depending on how it's taken care of. So quite often when we worry about how many times a text may have had to be copied, I think we look at it in terms of paper and paper and papyrus, which would cause you to have to copy it pretty regularly. But if the parchment lasts for 300 to 500 years, you wouldn't be copying it nearly as many times. And of course, in cuneiform, it would come down directly. So we also have who was doing the writing. Prior to the development of the alphabet, pretty much all the writing styles were extremely complex. I mean, you look at cuneiform, you look at the hieroglyphics, and really only professional scribes were literate. They were the only people who were writing at all. But once writing went to an alphabet type form, it became a lot more accessible to, we'll just call it, more normal people. And so literacy became much more widely spread. And at that point, you started to see the scribes becoming more of legal experts and then also copyists. So a lot of these manuscripts that would go down through the time frame would have been copied by some of these professional scribes. So let's talk about the manuscripts specifically. Let's talk about the Old Testament. How did we get the Old Testament text? Well, the modern texts we have really come from the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. So let's talk about those a little bit. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament that was begun by tradition in about 280 BC. And the reason it's called the Septuagint is it was done by 70 translators, and Septuagint is Greek for 70. The reason why we're talking about a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible is after the conquest of Alexander the Great, pretty much the entire Mediterranean world spoke Greek and was culturally Greek. There was a widespread diaspora of Jews. They were everywhere throughout the Mediterranean. A large number of Jews lived outside the Holy Land and had never even been to Israel. And so there was very little knowledge of Hebrew. And in fact, probably a lot of Jews in the Holy Land didn't really know Hebrew as well as their ancestors had. But everyone spoke Greek. so it made sense to translate the text to make the Old Testament, to make the Torah more accessible to Jews who spoke Greek. So, in terms of the Septuagint, the oldest known full text we have of the Septuagint, the entire Old Testament, is the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, and they're both dated from right around 325 AD. So a good little while back. Now, the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the official Hebrew translation. And the traditions tell us that it was begun sometime in around 160 AD. So the Septuagint is actually older than the Masoretic text. The Masoretic is named for the Masoretes, who were the translators of it. There's a lot of different discussions and reasons for the Masoretic text. One of them, and I won't dwell on this much, but one of them is we find that in that time frame, in the early 1st and 2nd century AD, Christians had pretty much appropriated the Septuagint. They had taken the Old Testament and they were putting their New Testament right along with it, and so the Septuagint became something that the Christians used widely, and so a lot of Hebrew scholars started to reject the text for that and said we need to have our own Hebrew text, and so that's where the Masoretic came from. Now, the oldest known full text of the Masoretic is the Codex Leningrad, which dates from 1008 AD. So you're talking about 700 years difference between these two. Now, in general, the texts are very similar, but there are some differences in certain areas, and some of these areas, if you're of a conspiracy theory mind, might make you think that some things got changed just due to disagreements between Christians and Jews. So we won't dwell any more on that other than to say the larger sense of the Bible is still maintained there. So what about the New Testament? What can we say about the New Testament texts? Well, we have the Ryland's Papyrus, which I'll show you in just a minute. And then we have various codexes. And again, codex, probably should have explained this before, is a fancy name for a bound book. So these are complete texts of the Bible, not a scroll of this book or that book, but a complete text of the Bible. So we have the Ryland's Papyrus, and this actually is Ryland's Fragment 52, which is a portion of the Gospel of John. Now, again, a criticism that was made of the Gospel texts is that they must have been written so long after the time of Christ that just like your grandfather tells you a story and it gets bigger and bigger every time he tells it, same kind of thing there. There's so much time between the events and writing it down that it just doesn't you won't recognize it. However, again, a lot of the textual scholars will tell you they think that John wrote his gospel sometime in about 80 or 90 AD. Well, this Ryland's Fragment 52 is dated from about 150 AD, which that's not really enough time for a legend to grow. So a lot of scholars kind of gave up on that aspect of it, and many of them will kind of nod their heads, sort of that maybe the Gospels really did come down kind of the way they were written initially. Now we also have our good friend, the Codex Sinaiticus. Not only is it the oldest complete copy of the Old Testament, it is also the oldest complete copy of the New Testament. And again, it dates from 325 AD. Now, a noteworthy thing I wanted to point out here, and it's not so much about the archaeology, but just about the Bible. A study a while back found that by about 350 AD, even if all the texts of the New Testament itself were just taken away, disappeared, what have you, that there were enough quotations of the New Testament by the church fathers in commentaries and other places in letters that you could conceivably reconstruct the entire New Testament minus 11 verses from just these writings. So I think that's a very interesting, unique aspect of the New Testament. All right, so we've got the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'm not going to talk about the Apocrypha, but maybe something even better. You're asking me, so what about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Where do the Dead Sea Scrolls fit in this whole thing? Well, they kind of fit right in the middle, actually. The time frame for the Dead Sea Scrolls is debated somewhat, but it's anywhere from about 225 BC to about 50 AD. So definitely in that sweet spot between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. So what do we know about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, they were found in a series of caves in Qumran, which is down near the Dead Sea, and they were found sealed up in these pots, which actually protected them. They started finding these scrolls in 1947. Actually, a shepherd boy found the first one looking for a goat. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain over 900 different texts or fragments, and lots of different languages: Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, Nabatean. Only about, well, less than half, about 40% of the actual texts found so far are biblical passages, and every book of the Old Testament, with the exception of Esther, is represented in these finds of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, when this first was announced and everything, there was some concern. What happens if we translate these scrolls and they don't match the Bible we have now? What are we going to do? What are we going to believe? So there was a certain amount of consternation there, but I can tell you that while they are not word for word, while they are not identical, which if they were identical, that would be very suspect, the translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls really show no significant changes in any major doctrine of Christianity. So so you can rest easily if you're a believer. So let's look at the Bible in terms of history, and this is going to be something we're going to do a lot as we go through the various time periods in our study. So we again have our good friends at Wikipedia to thank for this definition. History is an academic discipline that uses narrative to describe, examine, question, and analyze a sequence of past events, investigating the patterns of cause and effect related to them. So history is a series of events, and series of events have eyewitnesses. And as we know from crime shows, every eyewitness sees things just a little bit different. So it's not uncommon for there to be a slightly different perspective of the same events. And that's not just true of individuals, that's also true of societies and even nations. So how do we handle this? Well, again, Dr. Collins, one of my professors, likes to say, if the Bible is true and if ancient Near Eastern history is true, then they should be able to work alongside each other. And that's really the concept that he puts forward in terms of the historical synchronism. Historical synchronism is a point of correspondence between two or more parallel histories. Now, bear in mind, there's no unified history books. There's no agreed upon history in the ancient world. So the Egyptians think things happen a certain way. The Hebrews think things happen a certain way. The Hittites think things happen a certain way. But if you can look at their accounts and you can find the places where they touch and the places where the same events are being talked about, you can come to a lot of very interesting conclusions, and it can be a very valuable method to really hammer out the history in that regard. So even beyond the history, let's talk about culture as well. And culture is a pretty all-encompassing term. It can be almost anything. It's like an umbrella. Anything can be considered culture, but the more unique and the more distinctive something is, the more it's going to be identified as a piece of culture. So Wikipedia tells us that culture encompasses the social behavior and norms found in human societies, as well as the knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, and habits of the individuals in these groups. So the whole reason we make a distinction of culture is because different groups of people act different ways. They have different knowledge and beliefs and so forth, and all those, and all that laundry list there. But the more distinctive a bit of culture is, the more different it is from all of its neighbors. And sometimes culture is not just associated only with a group of people. It can also be associated with a time period. And so the more distinctive, the more different, the more unique a certain cultural aspect is, the more useful it will be to us in archaeology to date a find or to place something in terms of where it came from. And that concept that we'll be revisiting as we go through the various time periods of the Bible is going to be the term cultural specificity. And that is an element of culture existing uniquely in specific times and places. So a cultural specificity is something that's so unique to a particular people in a particular time frame that when I see it, I can put my finger on it and I can say, this is the time and these are the people that this occurred. So we'll spend a little more time with cultural specificity as we go. So here's the point that's fraught with peril. Once we start to talk about the Bible and interpret it, because it's all about interpreting what we read, and we as human beings tend to interpret things differently. So I have to make allowances for the fact that you interpret the Bible differently than maybe I do. And of course, that also means that you're wrong and I'm right. But that's going to play out every time whenever you have an individual looking at their particular interpretation. However, sometimes maybe our interpretations may not line up with the facts. We may have a particular concept of the Bible that is not correct for how the Bible itself presents itself. So we always have to be mindful of that. We may be interpreting the Bible based on a 21st century outlook, and the Bible was written 3,000 years before that, and we don't take that into account. So we have to be conscious of that. You hear lots of people say, "I interpret the Bible literally." And while that's a nice statement to say, that's a dangerous concept, and I'm gonna maybe step on some toes or whatnot, but there is a lot of figurative language in the Bible. Just like if it rained earlier today and I come in and say it rained cats and dogs, as a cultural idiom, you all know what I mean. You know I mean that it rained a lot, but give it a few hundred years when that idiom goes out of fashion, and if that's written down and someone in that time frame reads it, they'll wonder, were there dogs and cats falling out of the sky? These people are ridiculous. There's no such thing. So we have to be very conscious of the fact that we are not as up on figurative language as we are in our own time frame. And then two, literal interpretations can be problematic just because we don't always know the common knowledge that would have been known by the people of the time, that would have been assumed by the writer. Everybody knows this, but in many cases we don't. There's a lot of agricultural allusions in scripture that would have been well known to people of the day, but very few people have that background who are reading the Bible today. Also, we have some incomplete knowledge of the language. There may be multiple meanings of words, and we may misinterpret them as well. So what I would put forward as a better aspect is let's look at interpreting the Bible authentically, That may be literally quite often, maybe literally most of the time, but we need to leave enough room in our outlook to allow us to be wrong and to adjust when we find that we are wrong. Let me give you an example, and this is even a fairly recent example. In my Bible study class this last week, we were discussing the book of Exodus, chapter 14, and there's a very well-known, common figure of speech from the Exodus that goes all the way back to the King James translation of the Bible. Pharaoh hardened his heart, and it was essentially, he's not going to change his mind. He's not going to do this. He is, and in many cases, it said God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and a lot of people have had difficulty with that. And I'll admit, I was probably one of them as well. Kind of a free will sort of thing. If God's hardening someone's heart, then that means that they don't have free will to make their own decisions, and that has all sorts of problems there. But if you get into the language a little bit deeper, and by no means am I a Hebrew scholar, but if you get into the Hebrew a little deeper, you'll find that there are 2 or 3 different Hebrew verbs that are translated as harden in the various accounts, in the various portions of the Exodus account. And you'll find there are times when it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and there are times when it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And those are 2 different verbs. One is hazak, that is when God was hardening Pharaoh's heart, and kabed, which is when he hardened his own heart. Now, hazak doesn't mean to change someone's mind. It doesn't mean to influence someone. What hazak means is it means to strengthen. It means to encourage. So basically, if you read that, it would seem to indicate that God is encouraging Pharaoh in the direction he's already going. Whereas kabed actually means the literal meaning of the word is heavy, to make something heavy. But it's a common usage term to say to be stubborn. So Pharaoh made himself stubborn. So again, these are aspects of the language that if you just look at it in the English, and especially if your translator maybe made it a certain way, you could lose the truth or the authentic intent of the text. So that kind of finishes us out for the Bible as archaeology. Let me leave you with a few additional references if you're interested. We have the Stones Cry Out by Dr. Randall Price. Dr. Price is unapologetically a Christian, and it comes through in his writing. This is a little bit more of, I guess, a popular treatment of biblical archaeology. There's nothing really wrong with it in terms of, I mean, the things he covers are reasonable and true, but a little less academic, which is not necessarily a bad thing if that's what you're looking for. Now, this one is really the one. If you just desire to get deep in the Old Testament in an academic sense and really get to the root of matters, On the Reliability of the Old Testament by Dr. Kenneth Kitchen is probably the best text. Goes for, I think, used on Amazon, probably about $20, so not terribly expensive. It's affectionately known as ORAT. But Dr. Kitchen is one of the world's leading Egyptologists, and he spent a lot of time just going through and looking at a lot of these historical things. He looked at a lot of criticisms of scholars. Dr. Kitchen's also a professing Christian. He looked at a lot of the criticisms of the various scholars and addressed a large number of them. And again, isn't able to answer all of them because some of them we just don't have enough information to answer. But this one, it's a big, thick book, but it's full of a lot of very good information if that's something that you're interested in. And then finally, many of you had asked me previously if there was a text for this course, and there really isn't. But if you're looking for a general, just good overall reference for biblical archaeology, I don't think there's a better one than the Harvest Handbook of Bible Lands Truth in Advertising. It was edited and put out by the faculty of the school that I'm going to, Veritas International. But one of the great things about it, it's very much written in layman's terminology, and it's got lots of pictures, which is great from my perspective. So again, appreciate y'all coming out, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.